Officer Sam Perkins drove his patrol car slowly down the quiet, pristine streets of the neighborhood. He adjusted the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of his own reflection. Clean-shaven, sharp-eyed, the perfect image of authority. Sam took pride in his work, especially when it came to protecting this particular community. To him, these people deserved to feel secure, and it was his job to keep it that way. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard, almost 8 p.m. The streets were mostly empty now, as they should be. Anything or anyone out of place caught his attention immediately. As he turned onto the next street, he noticed a figure standing outside a boutique, its lights dimmed, the store clearly closed. Sam's eyes narrowed. The man was black, dressed in a suit, but that didn't fit the scene in Sam's mind. He knew the owners of these shops. They didn't stay open this late, and they didn't cater to people like him. It wasn't about the suit. It was about the presence. Something about it felt wrong to him. Slowing his car to a stop, he watched for a moment, his hand resting on the radio. No immediate signs of trouble, but this was his beat, and he wouldn't let any potential threat go unchecked. He stepped out, feeling the familiar weight of his badge on his chest, and adjusted his belt, ensuring his equipment was in place. "Gotta keep an eye out for troublemakers," he muttered to himself as he walked towards the man. This isn't their playground. He approached with deliberate steps, his gaze locked on the man, who stood facing the boutique window, seemingly lost in thought. As Sam drew nearer, the man turned slightly, noticing him. There was no sign of nervousness or alarm in his eyes, just a calm, polite acknowledgement. "Good evening, officer," the man said, his voice measured and respectful. "Evening," Sam replied curtly, stopping a few feet away. He glanced around theatrically, making a show of scanning the surroundings, before fixing his gaze back on the man. "What are you doing here? This place is closed." The man nodded slowly, a faint smile on his lips, as if he were used to this kind of interaction. "I'm waiting for a friend." "She's running a bit late." Sam raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms over his chest. "Waiting for a friend, huh? And what business does she have around here after hours?" "She owns the place," the man answered, gesturing to the boutique window. "We were supposed to meet for dinner." Sam didn't believe him. He looked at the boutique window, then back at the man. There was no reason for him to trust this explanation, no matter how reasonable it sounded. His instincts, honed by years of patrolling and dealing with troublemakers, told him this man didn't belong here. "You expect me to believe that?" Sam's tone was incredulous, bordering on accusatory. "A friend? At this hour? You know this isn't a good place to be loitering." The man's expression didn't change. If anything, he seemed even calmer. "I understand your concern, officer, but I assure you, I'm just waiting. I don't mean any harm." Sam stepped closer, his body language shifting, becoming more aggressive. "Listen, I don't know what you think you're doing, but I know your type. You don't belong here, and I'm not going to let you hang around causing trouble. Why don't you just move along?" The man held his ground, maintaining eye contact. "Officer, I'm not doing anything illegal. I have a right to be here." Sam's patience, already thin, wore even thinner. The man's calm, almost dismissive attitude irked him. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not like this. "I'm telling you to leave. Now." His voice rose, the authority in it clear and unyielding. The man didn't flinch. "With all due respect, officer, I haven't broken any laws. I'm just standing here. I'd appreciate it if you didn't treat me like I'm doing something wrong." For a moment, they stood there, locked in a silent standoff. The street around them remained quiet, the only sound the distant hum of a passing car. Sam felt his pulse quicken. He wasn't going to let this guy defy him. Not here. Not in this neighborhood. He took a deep breath, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. "Fine. I'm going to need to see some ID. Now." The man reached into his jacket slowly, deliberately, and pulled out his wallet. He held it out to Sam, his expression unchanged. "Here you go." Sam didn't take it. Instead, he stared at the wallet suspiciously, his jaw tightening. He wasn't about to let this guy think he could control the situation. "Keep it. I don't need to see it." The man raised an eyebrow, confusion flickering across his face. "But you just asked for it." "I don't need your ID to know you don't belong here," Sam snapped. "I know exactly what you're up to. I've seen it 100 times before." The man sighed softly, his shoulders relaxing as if he'd expected this. "Officer, if you're judging me just because I'm standing here in this neighborhood, you're making a mistake. I'm not looking for trouble. I'm just waiting for my friend." Sam's hand hovered near his belt, not quite reaching for his weapon, but close enough to make a point. "You think you can talk your way out of this? I'm telling you to leave. Last chance." The man glanced at the boutique window, then back at Sam. His voice was steady, unwavering. "I've been polite, and I've complied with your requests, but I'm not leaving just because you feel uncomfortable with me being here." Sam's eyes flashed with anger. He was used to respect, to compliance. This man's calm defiance felt like a direct challenge, and he wasn't about to back down. He took a step closer, his voice low and menacing. "Then I'll make you leave." Sam's eyes remained locked on the man standing before him. Everything about this situation felt wrong. The man's calm, almost casual demeanor, his refusal to be intimidated, none of it fit the script Sam had in his head. He was used to seeing fear, or at least some respect, not this unsettling composure. "I said move along," Sam repeated, his voice sharp, the words slicing through the still evening air. His hand was now firmly resting on his holster, a subtle yet unmistakable threat. The man, still holding his wallet, glanced down at it before meeting Sam's gaze again. "Officer, I've already explained. I'm not here to cause any problems. Why are you so determined to make me leave? Waiting for a friend?" Sam's tone was mocking, disbelief evident. He glanced around theatrically, then back at the man. "Out here, in front of a closed store? Who do you think you're fooling?" The man's brow furrowed slightly, as if he couldn't understand why this was such a big deal. "I get it. You think I'm suspicious because I'm black, standing here, in this neighborhood. But I'm telling you, you're wrong. I'm just here for a friend." Sam took a step closer, narrowing the distance between them. "I've heard that line before. You don't belong here. You don't get to stand around and make people feel unsafe. So, I'm telling you, leave, now." The man didn't back down. Instead, he took a deep breath, his shoulders straightening. "You have no right to tell me to leave just because you don't like the way I look." Sam felt his blood boil. The man's calmness was infuriating, as if he believed he was untouchable, that he didn't have to follow the rules. Sam's voice dropped to a dangerous low, his patience running out. "Don't play games with me. I know what you're doing here." The man tilted his head slightly, genuine confusion on his face. "What am I doing here, officer?" Sam took another step forward, close enough now that he could see the faint lines around the man's eyes, the steady, unblinking gaze. "You're casing the place, looking for an opportunity. I've seen it 100 times. You're just waiting for a chance to break in, aren't you?" The man's eyes widened, and for the first time, his composure seemed to falter. I would never." He shook his head, his voice firm. "That's not what I'm doing. I'm here to meet my friend. I have no intention of causing any trouble." Sam's lips curled into a sneer. "Of course you'd say that, but I know what I see, and what I see is someone who doesn't belong, someone looking for an opportunity to make trouble." The man's voice took on a more urgent tone. "Officer, you're making a mistake. You're judging me because of what you assume about me, not because of what I'm actually doing." Sam's hand tightened around the grip of his holstered weapon, a wave of adrenaline rushing through him. He was in control here. He had to be. This man, whoever he was, wasn't going to make a fool out of him. "You think I'm stupid?" Sam spat. "You think I'm just going to let you stand around here looking for trouble? I've been doing this job for a long time, and I know exactly what your kind is up to." The man's face tightened, his jaw clenching briefly before he spoke again, his voice steady, but firmer now. "I'm not a threat. I have a right to be here, whether you like it or not." Sam's pulse quickened, anger and frustration clouding his thoughts. He wasn't going to be made a fool of. Not by this man. Not here in this neighborhood. "I don't care what you say. I'm telling you to leave. Now." The man shook his head, his voice calm but resolute. "I'm not leaving, officer. I've done nothing wrong." Sam's vision blurred with rage. This was insubordination, pure and simple. His authority was being challenged, and he wasn't going to stand for it. "You think you can just talk back to me? You think you can just do whatever you want?" The man's eyes remained steady, unwavering. "I'm not trying to talk back to you. I'm just not going to leave when I have no reason to." Sam shoved the man back, releasing his grip abruptly. The man stumbled slightly but didn't fall, his expression never changing. "Get out of here," Sam ordered, his voice low and dangerous. "Now." The man straightened, his hands at his sides, his posture still relaxed but unyielding. "Officer, I'm not going anywhere. I have every right to be here." The defiance in the man's tone, the refusal to back down, sent a fresh surge of fury through Sam. He took a step forward, his hand reaching for the man's shoulder, ready to shove him again, to force him to comply, to make him understand that he wasn't in control here. But the man didn't flinch, didn't try to move away. "Officer, I'm not here to cause trouble," he said quietly, his voice steady. "You're the one escalating this, not me." "I don't care what you want," Sam exploded, his hand gripping the man's shoulder hard enough to bruise. "You don't get to stand here and act like you're above the rules, like you don't have to listen to me. I'm telling you to leave, and you're going to leave." The man's eyes, dark and calm, seemed to search Sam's face for a moment, as if he were looking for something. Then he shook his head slowly, his voice soft but firm. "I'm not going to leave, officer. I have a right to be here. Sam's hand trembled with the effort of holding back the urge to lash out, to make this man pay for his insolence, for the way he kept talking back, for the way he stood there like he wasn't afraid. "You think I won't make you leave?" he snarled, his voice shaking with rage. The man's voice was almost gentle now, as if he were speaking to a child. "Officer, you're making a mistake." Sam's vision narrowed, his world shrinking down to the man in front of him, the infuriating calm in his eyes, the maddening steadiness in his voice. "The only mistake here is you thinking you can get away with this." And then, without another word, Sam shoved the man hard, slamming him back against the glass window of the boutique. The man let out a grunt of pain, his hands coming up instinctively to protect himself, but he still didn't fight back, didn't resist. Something snapped inside Sam. The man's calmness, his refusal to show fear, was infuriating. Before he realized what he was doing, Sam's fist flew forward, connecting hard with the man's jaw. The punch sent him reeling, his head snapping to the side as he staggered against the glass. "Is this what you want?" Sam shouted, his voice echoing in the empty street. "Is this what you were looking for?" The man's breath was coming faster now, his hand gingerly touching his jaw where a bruise was already forming. But his eyes stayed on Sam's, unwavering. "I don't want any trouble, officer. Please just—" "Shut up!" Sam roared, his hands grabbing the man's jacket again, yanking him forward, then shoving him back into the glass. "I'm done listening to your excuses." Pain. But he still didn't resist. "Officer, please, just check my ID." I don't care about your ID," Sam shouted, his voice raw, his vision swimming with rage. "I'm gonna make sure you understand who's in charge here." And with that, he yanked the man around, twisting his arms behind his back and slamming him face first against the window. The man let out a gasp, his body tensing, but he didn't struggle, didn't try to pull away. "Stay still," Sam barked, his voice harsh and unsteady. He fumbled for his cuffs, his hands shaking, adrenaline coursing through him in a dizzying rush. "You're under arrest for resisting an officer." The man's voice was strained but still calm. "I'm not resisting. I'm not—" "Shut up!" Sam snapped, snapping the cuffs onto the man's wrists, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst. "I don't want to hear another word out of you." The man fell silent, his body still, his face pressed against the glass. Sam stepped back, breathing hard, his hands trembling with the force of his rage. He stared at the man, at the calm, unbroken line of his back, at the way he didn't struggle, didn't fight. "You think you can make a fool out of me?" Sam muttered, his voice shaking. "You think you can just stand here and talk back and I'm gonna let you get away with it?" The man didn't respond. He just stood there, his breathing slow and even, his shoulders relaxed, as if he were waiting for something. Sam's hands curled into fists at his sides. He wanted to hit him, to make him hurt, to make him pay for the way he'd stood there, calm and defiant, like he wasn't afraid, but he couldn't. "Not here, not now." "Stay there," he ordered, his voice cold. "I'm calling this in." He turned away, his hands still trembling as he reached for his radio. He had to get back up, had to get someone here to see this, to witness what this man had done, how he'd challenged him, how he'd refused to listen. He had to prove that he was in control, that he wasn't weak, that he was still the one in charge. But as he raised the radio to his mouth, he heard the man's voice, quiet and calm. "Officer, please, just check my ID." Sam froze, the words hanging in the air between them. He turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as he stared at the man, still cuffed, still standing there, still calm. "What did you say?" he demanded, his voice sharp. The man turned his head slightly, meeting Sam's gaze. "Check my ID. It's in my jacket pocket." Sam's grip on the radio tightened. He didn't want to give this man anything, didn't want to acknowledge that there might be something more going on here than what he'd seen, what he'd assumed. But something in the man's voice, in the steady, unwavering calm in his eyes, made him pause. Slowly, reluctantly, he stepped forward, his hand reaching out to pat down the man's jacket. He found the wallet easily, his fingers brushing against the smooth leather. He hesitated for a moment, then pulled it out, flipping it open with a rough, jerky motion, and then he froze. Inside the wallet, nestled behind a clear plastic window, was an FBI badge. Sam's breath caught in his throat, his mind racing, his heart pounding in his ears. He stared at the badge, at the name printed on the ID card beneath it, Special Agent Malcolm Gray, FBI. For a moment, he couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The world seemed to tilt around him, his vision narrowing to that single, damning piece of identification in his hand. He looked up, his eyes wide, his face pale. The man, Agent Gray, was watching him, his gaze steady, unblinking. "Now do you understand?" Agent Gray said quietly, his voice calm, almost gentle. "You were making assumptions about me from the moment you saw me. Sam's hand shook as he stared at the badge, his mind reeling, his world crumbling around him. He'd made a mistake, a terrible, unforgivable mistake. And now, it was too late to take it back. Sam's fingers trembled as he held the wallet, his eyes glued to the badge inside. The weight of the situation crashed down on him like a tidal wave, leaving him stunned and breathless. He couldn't look away from the words etched on the ID card. Special Agent Malcolm Gray, FBI. For a few seconds, everything seemed to blur. The street, the boutique, the man he'd just roughly cuffed, all of it faded into the background, leaving only the stark reality of his mistake. His mind struggled to process what he was seeing, his anger and adrenaline draining away, replaced by a cold, creeping fear. Malcolm stood still, his back against the glass, his hands cuffed, but his presence radiated calm authority. He was watching Sam with an unreadable expression, his face composed despite the rough treatment he'd just endured. "Officer," Malcolm said quietly, his voice even and measured, "now that you know who I am, I need you to listen very carefully." Sam's mouth felt dry. He swallowed hard, trying to find his voice, but all that came out was a strained, choked sound. You didn't know," Malcolm finished for him, his tone calm but firm. "I understand that. But that doesn't change what's happened." Sam's hand dropped to his side, the wallet still clutched tightly in his fist. He stared at Malcolm, his mind racing. He needed to think, needed to figure out a way to fix this, to make it right. But no matter how hard he tried, his thoughts kept circling back to the same inescapable fact. He had just manhandled an FBI agent, and not just any FBI agent, one who was here, in his precinct, for a reason. What are you doing here?" Sam asked, his voice cracking slightly. He took a shaky step back, his eyes darting around as if looking for some kind of escape. "Why are you here?" Malcolm took a deep breath, shifting slightly against the window, his wrists still bound by the cuffs. "I'm here because you, and officers like you, have been under investigation for quite some time." Sam felt his heart plummet. He blinked, struggling to make sense of the words. "Investigation?" he repeated, his voice faint. "For what?" "For misconduct," Malcolm replied, his eyes never leaving Sam's. "For abuse of power. For targeting people based on their race and using excessive force. Tonight, you've demonstrated exactly why we're here." Sam's head spun, his pulse thundering in his ears. "That's not true," he said, his voice rising in panic. "I've never—" Malcolm cut him off, his voice still calm but carrying an edge of authority that silenced Sam instantly. "Tonight, you saw a man standing outside a closed boutique, and you assumed the worst. You decided he was guilty before you even spoke to him. You used force when none was needed. And you ignored every attempt I made to explain the situation." Sam shook his head, the reality of the situation slipping further and further out of his control. "I thought," he started, then stopped, his throat tight. "I thought you were someone who didn't belong?" Malcolm asked, raising an eyebrow. "Someone who had no right to be here?" Sam's face burned with shame. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He'd known deep down that he was making assumptions. He'd known that he was acting out of anger, out of a need to assert control. But hearing it laid out like this, calm and unflinching, stripped away any excuses he might have had. "Officer Perkins," Malcolm continued, his tone softening just a fraction, "tonight was part of a much larger operation. I've been working undercover for months, documenting the misconduct and corruption within your precinct. Your actions tonight were the final piece we needed." Sam's heart skipped a beat. Undercover. His mind raced, trying to piece together everything he knew, everything he'd seen and heard in the station. Had anyone else known? Were they all being watched? He took another step back, his legs feeling weak. "No," he murmured, shaking his head. "This can't be." "I didn't know." Malcolm nodded, his expression still calm. "I believe you didn't know who I was. But that doesn't change what you did. It doesn't change the fact that this isn't just about tonight." Sam's hands began to shake. He looked down at them, feeling like they belonged to someone else. "You're saying you've been watching us? For how long?" "Long enough," Malcolm replied, his voice steady. "Long enough to see patterns of behavior, to see how certain officers target specific people, how they use their authority to intimidate and harass, how they use force when it's not necessary, to make themselves feel powerful." Sam's breath hitched. He felt exposed, laid bare. Everything he'd done, every decision he'd made in the heat of the moment, every time he'd let his temper get the better of him. It was all out in the open now, documented and catalogued. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Malcolm's gaze softened slightly, though his expression remained serious. "What happens now is that you're going to face the consequences of your actions. I've already called for backup. Agents will be here soon to take you into custody." Sam's eyes widened, panic surging through him. "Custody? You're arresting me?" Malcolm nodded. Yes, you've committed several violations tonight alone, not to mention what's already in the reports. There's no avoiding it, Officer Perkins. Sam's world seemed to tilt. Everything he knew, everything he was, slipping out of his grasp. He looked around, as if someone, anyone, could step in and stop this. But the street was empty, the windows dark. There was no one to help him, no one to save him from what he'd done. His eyes darted back to Malcolm, desperation clawing at him. You don't understand. I didn't mean to. I was just trying to do my job. I thought you were trouble? Malcolm finished for him, his voice soft but firm. I know, but that's the problem, Officer Perkins. You didn't see a man standing there. You saw a threat. You saw someone you needed to control. Sam's breath caught in his throat. What am I supposed to do? He asked, his voice cracking. Malcolm's expression was sympathetic, but his eyes were unyielding. You're supposed to face the consequences of your actions. And maybe, if you're willing to help us, we can talk about what happens next. Sam's heart pounded. Help you? What do you mean? Malcolm leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a low, even tone. You're not the only one we're investigating. There are others in your precinct, officers who've been involved in far worse. If you cooperate, if you help us take them down, it could make a difference in what happens to you. Sam felt a flicker of hope, but it was quickly extinguished by the overwhelming fear and shame that still gripped him. He was trapped, caught between his loyalty to the force and the crushing reality of what he'd done. Before he could respond, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. Sam's stomach twisted, dread coiling tight inside him. Malcolm straightened, his eyes never leaving Sam's. They're here. You need to decide, Officer Perkins. Are you going to help us, or are you going to go down with the rest? Sam's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He was frozen, his mind a tangled mess of fear, guilt, and confusion. The sirens were deafening now, the flashing lights reflecting off the store windows. Malcolm stepped back, giving Sam space as the FBI vehicles pulled up, agents spilling out and surrounding them. Sam's heart pounded in his chest as they approached, his eyes darting around wildly. Agent Gray, one of the agents called, his voice steady and commanding. Everything under control? Malcolm nodded, his gaze still fixed on Sam. Yes, Officer Perkins is coming with us. Sam's knees almost buckled. He felt the agents close in around him, felt the cold steel of their hands on his shoulders as they began to lead him away. His mind was a blur, his thoughts a chaotic storm of regret and disbelief. As they reached the car, Malcolm's voice cut through the haze, calm and clear. It's not over yet, Officer Perkins. You have a choice to make. Sam turned, his eyes meeting Malcolm's one last time. He saw no anger there, no triumph, just a steady, unyielding resolve. And then the car door closed, and the world outside blurred, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the terrifying, inescapable truth of what he'd done. Sam sat in the back of the FBI car, the cuffs digging into his wrists. The air felt thick and suffocating inside the vehicle. He watched through the tinted window as Malcolm spoke to the team of agents gathering around him. The flashing lights from the police cars painted the street in alternating shades of red and blue, illuminating the scene like a twisted, surreal show. Malcolm stood with his back to the car, gesturing towards the boutique. Sam couldn't hear what he was saying, but the agents listened intently, their faces serious. A few glanced towards the car where Sam sat, their expressions unreadable. He felt exposed, as if they were all judging him, condemning him for his actions. His mind raced with desperate thoughts, each one more frantic than the last. He wanted to believe this was all a misunderstanding, that somehow it could be fixed, but the badge still burned in his memory. Special Agent Malcolm Gray, FBI. He had assaulted an undercover FBI agent. There was no way out of that. The sound of a car door opening startled him. Malcolm slid into the passenger seat beside the driver, turning slightly to face Sam in the back. Officer Perkins, Malcolm began, his voice calm but firm. You need to understand the seriousness of what's happening here. Sam swallowed hard, his throat dry. I didn't know, he said, his voice cracking. I didn't know who you were. You thought I was a threat because I was a black man standing in a white neighborhood. Malcolm interrupted, his eyes steady and piercing. You assumed I didn't belong, that I was up to no good, despite everything I tried to tell you. Sam felt a surge of defensiveness, but it quickly faded under the weight of Malcolm's gaze. I was just doing my job, he mumbled, though the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Malcolm shook his head slightly. Your job is to protect and serve, not to judge and punish. What you did tonight was abuse your power because you felt threatened by something you didn't understand. Sam's heart pounded. He looked down at his hands, the cuffs binding them together. I didn't mean to. Intent doesn't change what happened. Malcolm said sharply, cutting him off. You put your hands on an innocent person, cuffed him, and slammed him against a window because you thought you could. And this isn't the first time, is it? Sam's breath hitched. He felt like the walls were closing in on him. He remembered other nights, other confrontations, the anger that had simmered just beneath the surface, driving his actions. He had always justified it to himself, telling himself he was doing what needed to be done. But now, in the cold, unrelenting light of this moment, those justifications crumbled. Malcolm leaned back slightly, his gaze never leaving Sam's face. We've been investigating the precinct for months. Your actions tonight were just the final piece of the puzzle. There are others, officers who have done far worse, but your behavior gave us exactly what we needed. Sam's mind reeled. Others? He echoed, his voice barely a whisper. Who? Malcolm's expression hardened. That's not something you need to know right now. What matters is that you have a choice. You can help us, or you can go down with the rest. Sam's throat tightened. He could barely think, let alone make a decision like that. Everything he thought he knew, everything he believed he was doing to protect this community, it was all slipping away, unraveling in front of him. Help you how? He asked, his voice trembling. Malcolm leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering. You can cooperate with our investigation. Give us information about the officers you've seen using excessive force, the ones who've been covering up their tracks. You help us take down the network of corruption in your precinct, and it will make a difference in what happens to you. Sam stared at Malcolm, his mind spinning. His loyalty to his fellow officers, the bonds he'd thought were unbreakable, clashed violently with the reality of his situation. He was trapped, caught between his duty and the undeniable truth of his actions. Before he could respond, he heard the sound of approaching sirens, growing louder with each second. His heart sank. He knew what was coming. Backup, more agents, more witnesses to his fall. Malcolm turned his head slightly, listening as the sirens drew closer. They're almost here. You need to decide, Officer Perkins. Are you going to help us, or are you going to go down with the rest? Sam's mouth went dry. He looked out the window again, seeing the flicker of red and blue lights as more FBI vehicles pulled up. Agents spilled out, moving quickly to secure the area, their expressions focused and professional. He felt like he was in a nightmare, watching everything he knew slip further and further out of his grasp. Malcolm's voice cut through his spiraling thoughts, calm but insistent. You can make this right, Officer Perkins. It's not too late. Sam turned back to him, his eyes wide and desperate. I don't know what to do, he whispered. I don't know what you want from me. I want you to tell the truth, Malcolm said simply. I want you to take responsibility for what you've done and help us clean up this mess. You can start by telling us what you know. Sam's heart pounded painfully in his chest. He felt the weight of his choices pressing down on him, crushing him. He had always prided himself on being in control, on knowing what to do, but now he felt utterly lost. The car door opened again, and an agent leaned in, his voice low and respectful. Agent Gray, we're ready to transport him. Malcolm nodded, his eyes never leaving Sam's face. Take a moment, he said quietly to the agent before turning back to Sam. This is your last chance to do the right thing, Officer Perkins. Are you going to help us? Sam's breath came in short, shallow bursts. He looked down at his hands again, at the cuffs that bound him, at the life he had thrown away in a single, reckless moment. He knew what he should say, knew what the right choice was, but fear and confusion clouded his mind. His voice trailed off, his words faltering. Malcolm watched him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. It's okay, he said, his voice gentle. You don't have to decide right now, but when you're ready, we'll be here. He nodded to the agent, who stepped forward, reaching for Sam's arm. Sam flinched, but didn't resist, as they helped him out of the car. The street outside was a blur of lights and movement, agents moving in efficient, practiced motions. He felt disconnected, like he was watching it all happen from a distance. As they led him towards one of the waiting vehicles, he caught sight of a few neighbors still lingering on their porches, watching the scene with wide, curious eyes. He felt a pang of shame, knowing what they must be thinking, knowing what he must look like to them. A disgrace, a failure. Malcolm's voice echoed in his mind as he was guided into the back seat of the waiting car. This is your last chance to do the right thing. He closed his eyes, his heart pounding, his thoughts a tangled mess of fear and regret. He didn't know what the future held, didn't know if he would ever be able to make this right. But as the car pulled away, the lights of the boutique fading into the distance, one thing was clear. His life would never be the same again. The sound of the cell door closing behind him echoed in Sam's ears like a gunshot. He stood in the middle of the small, stark room, his hands still cuffed in front of him. The walls seemed to close in around him, the reality of his situation hitting him with full force. His mind raced, struggling to process everything that had happened, everything that he had lost in a single devastating night. He stared blankly at the metal bench against the far wall, the only piece of furniture in the room. The air was cool, sterile, carrying the faint metallic scent of disinfectant. He felt disconnected from himself, as if he were floating above it all, watching someone else live this nightmare. The door swung open, and Sam flinched, his eyes snapping up. Malcolm stepped into the cell, his expression calm but serious. He glanced at the cuffs still binding Sam's wrists, then looked up at the guard standing just outside the door. "Remove them," Malcolm said quietly. The guard hesitated, then nodded and stepped forward, unlocking the cuffs and slipping them off Sam's wrists. Sam rubbed at his sore skin, the relief of the metal's absence almost too much to bear. He looked down at his reddened wrists, a reminder of the last hour's events, the last hour that had shattered his life. "Thank you," Malcolm said to the guard, who nodded and stepped back, closing the door behind him. Malcolm turned his attention back to Sam, his eyes steady. "Sit down, Officer Perkins." Sam's legs felt weak, barely able to support his weight. He sank down onto the bench, his head in his hands. I don't understand how this happened," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "I was just trying to do my job." Malcolm remained standing, his gaze fixed on Sam. "You were trying to do your job as you saw it, but your view was skewed by your own biases, your own need to assert control." Sam looked up, his eyes wide and desperate. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," he said, his voice cracking. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Malcolm nodded slowly. "I believe you, but that doesn't change what you did, or why you did it." Sam's breath hitched. He felt the weight of Malcolm's words pressing down on him, suffocating him. He had spent years justifying his actions, convincing himself that he was doing the right thing, that he was protecting people. But now, in the cold, unforgiving light of this cell, those justifications seemed hollow and meaningless. "I thought I was making a difference," he whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. "I thought I was protecting this neighborhood, these people." Malcolm's expression softened slightly, but his eyes remained sharp. "And how did you do that, Officer Perkins?" "By assuming anyone who didn't fit your idea of normal was a threat. By using your badge as a weapon instead of a shield?" Sam's hands clenched into fists. "I didn't think about it like that," he admitted, his voice raw. I wanted to keep things safe." "Safe for who?" Malcolm asked quietly. "Safe for the people you thought deserved protection? Or safe for yourself, to keep your sense of power and control intact?" The words cut through Sam like a knife. He felt exposed, vulnerable, every defense he had crumbling away. He had always prided himself on being strong, on being the one who could handle anything, but now he felt like a child, lost and afraid. "I never wanted to hurt anyone," he said again, his voice shaking. I didn't realize." Malcolm stepped closer, his gaze never leaving Sam's. "You didn't realize because you didn't have to. You were in a position of power, and you never had to question it. You never had to see the people you were targeting as real people, with lives and families, with rights that you were supposed to protect." Sam's chest tightened, his heart pounding painfully. He had always thought of himself as a good officer, someone who did what needed to be done to keep people safe. But now, he saw how blind he had been, how his need to control had led him down a path of abuse and harm. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What happens to me?" Malcolm sighed softly, his gaze softening. "That depends on you, Officer Perkins. You have a choice. You can cooperate with us, help us root out the corruption in your precinct, or you can go down with the rest of them." Sam looked up at him, his eyes filled with confusion and fear. "I don't know what to do," he admitted. "I don't know who to trust." Malcolm's expression was gentle but firm. "Trust yourself, Officer Perkins. Trust that you know what the right thing to do is. You've spent a long time convincing yourself that you were doing the right thing, even when you weren't. Now, you have a chance to actually do it." Sam's hands trembled in his lap. He felt torn, caught between his loyalty to his fellow officers and the undeniable truth of what he had done. He thought about the other officers in his precinct, the ones he had looked up to, the ones who had encouraged him, who had cheered him on when he had acted aggressively, telling him he was doing a good job. "I can't just turn on them," he said weakly. "I've known some of them for years. They're like family." Malcolm's gaze hardened. "Family doesn't encourage you to do things that destroy lives. They don't stand by and watch while you ruin yourself and others. The people you think of as family have been using you, encouraging you to act in ways that serve their own interests, not the community's." Sam shook his head, his thoughts a tangled mess. "I don't know what to believe anymore." Malcolm took a step back, giving him space. "That's why you need to take some time. Think about what you've done, and think about what you want to do now. This is your chance to make things right, not just for yourself, but for the people you've hurt. And for the community you say you want to protect. Sam stared at the floor, his mind racing. He thought about all the times he had acted without thinking, all the times he had let his anger and fear drive his actions. He thought about the people he had targeted, the ones he had dismissed as troublemakers without ever really seeing them. And he thought about Malcolm, standing there, offering him a chance to make amends. "I don't know if I can do it," he whispered. "I don't know if I'm strong enough." Malcolm's voice was gentle but firm. "You are. It's not about strength, Officer Perkins. It's about courage. The courage to admit when you're wrong, and the courage to do what's right, even when it's hard." Sam looked up at him, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "And if I help you, what happens then?" Malcolm hesitated, then nodded slowly. "If you help us, we'll do what we can to help you. We can't erase what you've done, but we can give you a chance to make amends, to show that you're willing to change." Sam's heart pounded. He thought about the future, about what it would mean to turn against the people he had thought of as allies, to expose the corruption that he had been a part of. He thought about the risks, the consequences, the way his life would be forever changed. But then he thought about the alternative, going down with them, being part of a system that hurt people, that destroyed lives. And he knew, deep down, that he couldn't do it anymore. He couldn't keep pretending that what he had done was right, that the way he had acted was justified. He took a deep breath, his hands still trembling, and looked up at Malcolm. "Okay," he said softly. "I'll help you. I don't know how much I can do, but I'll try." Malcolm nodded, his expression unreadable. "That's all we're asking for, Officer Perkins. Just try." Sam nodded slowly, the reality of his decision sinking in. He didn't know what the future held, didn't know if he could ever truly make amends for what he had done. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was taking a step in the right direction, a step towards something better. As Malcolm turned to leave, he paused at the door, looking back at Sam. "We'll talk more tomorrow. Get some rest. You have a long road ahead of you." Sam watched him go, the door closing behind him with a soft click. He leaned back against the wall, his mind still spinning, his heart still aching. But there was a small, fragile hope growing inside him, a hope that maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to make things right. For the first time that night, he felt a glimmer of something he hadn't felt in a long time: relief. He had made a choice, and now, all he could do was follow it through and hope that it would be enough. The cold fluorescent lights of the FBI conference room cast a harsh glare on the table's polished surface. Malcolm sat at the head, his hands folded in front of him, his eyes focused and intense. Around him, his team gathered, agents who had been working tirelessly on the investigation that had led to Sam's arrest and the impending shakeup within the precinct. Detective Rachel Morgan, Malcolm's colleague and trusted partner in the operation, sat to his right, a thick file of documents in front of her. She flipped through the pages, her brow furrowed with concentration. To her left sat several agents, their expressions serious, their attention fully on the task at hand. "Let's get started," Malcolm said, his voice steady and commanding. "We've got a lot to go through, and not much time before this breaks wide open." Rachel nodded, sliding a report towards him. "We've gathered statements from several officers who were willing to talk, mostly rookies and those on the periphery. They've confirmed what we suspected: systematic abuse of power, targeting of minorities, and cover-ups for excessive use of force incidents." Malcolm's jaw tightened. "Names?" Rachel glanced down at her notes. "Captain Richard Collins is the primary instigator. He's been manipulating reports, ensuring that any complaints against his preferred officers are buried. He's encouraged a culture of aggression, particularly among the younger officers." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of the information hanging heavy in the air. Malcolm felt a familiar surge of frustration. He had known about Collins for years, had seen the damage he had done, but getting solid evidence had always been difficult. Now they had it. All the pieces were coming together, and they were finally in a position to act. "Who else?" Malcolm asked, his voice tense. Rachel flipped another page. "Lieutenant Harris and Sergeant Green. They've both been involved in multiple incidents of misconduct, including falsifying reports and intimidating witnesses. There's also evidence that they've been protecting certain officers from investigations, especially those involved in violent confrontations." Malcolm nodded, his mind working quickly. Harris and Green were Collins's right-hand men, the ones who ensured that his orders were carried out without question. Taking them down would be crucial in dismantling the network of corruption that had poisoned the precinct. "What about Perkins?" one of the agents asked, his voice cutting through the silence. Malcolm glanced at Rachel, then back at the agent. "Perkins is a key piece. He's not the worst of them, but he's been involved in enough incidents to make him valuable. If he cooperates, we can use his testimony to strengthen our case against the others." The agent nodded thoughtfully. "Do you think he'll flip?" Malcolm hesitated, thinking back to his conversation with Sam in the holding cell. He had seen the fear, the confusion in the man's eyes, but also something else. A glimmer of regret, a hint that maybe, just maybe, he was beginning to understand the gravity of what he had done. "I think he might," Malcolm said finally. "He's scared, and he knows he's in deep trouble. If we play it right, we can get him to talk." Rachel leaned forward, her expression serious. "We need him to talk, Malcolm. Collins is smart. He'll have contingency plans, ways to deflect attention and protect himself. If Perkins doesn't cooperate, we could lose our shot at bringing the whole network down." Malcolm nodded slowly. He knew the stakes, knew how much was riding on this. They had spent months building this case, gathering evidence, talking to witnesses, people who had risked their careers and their safety to speak out against the corruption that had taken hold of the precinct. They couldn't afford to let it all fall apart now. "We'll keep the pressure on Perkins," he said, his voice firm. "Make sure he knows what's at stake, both for himself and for the community. If he's going to flip, he needs to see that it's the only way out." Rachel nodded, but there was a hint of uncertainty in her eyes. "And if he doesn't?" Malcolm's gaze hardened. "Then we go after him like we would any other corrupt officer. He's already crossed the line. If he refuses to cooperate, he'll face the full consequences." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of Malcolm's words sinking in. Everyone knew what that meant. Prison time, the end of a career, the complete and utter destruction of everything Sam had built. It wasn't a threat, it was a promise. If Sam didn't help them, he would be left to face the fallout alone. Rachel cleared her throat, breaking the silence. "We've got more evidence coming in from the surveillance we set up around the precinct. Officers have been talking, and some of them are nervous. They know something's going down, but they don't know what." "Good," Malcolm said, a grim smile tugging at his lips. "Let them sweat. The more uncertain they are, the more likely they are to make mistakes." He leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. The operation had been long and grueling, filled with setbacks and frustrations, but now they were finally seeing progress. It wasn't just about taking down Collins and his cronies. It was about restoring faith in the system, about showing the community that justice would be served, no matter who was involved. "We need to move quickly," Malcolm said, his voice decisive. "We'll focus on Perkins first, get his statement and see what he's willing to give us. Then we move on Harris and Green. We need to cut off Collins' support before he has a chance to react." Rachel nodded, her gaze steady. "And Collins?" Malcolm's eyes narrowed. "He's the endgame. Once we've got enough on him, we go in hard and fast. No room for maneuvering, no time for him to destroy evidence or intimidate witnesses. We take him down cleanly and decisively." There was a murmur of agreement around the table. Everyone knew what was at stake, knew how important it was to get this right. Collins had been a blight on the precinct for too long, his influence spreading like a cancer, corrupting everything it touched. Bringing him down would be a victory not just for the FBI, but for every officer who had tried to do the right thing, for every citizen who had suffered because of his actions. "We need to stay sharp," Malcolm said, his voice low but firm. "No mistakes, no slip-ups. This is our shot, and we're not going to miss it." Rachel looked around the room, her gaze meeting each agent's eyes in turn. "We've all worked hard to get here. We've put in the hours, taken the risks. Now we need to follow through. We need to be smart. We need to be careful. And we need to be relentless." There were nods of agreement, the tension in the room thick but focused. This was what they had been working towards, the culmination of months of effort and sacrifice. There was no turning back now, no room for doubt or hesitation. Malcolm glanced at the clock on the wall, then back at his team. "Let's get to work. We've got a lot to do, and not much time to do it." The room erupted into activity. Agents gathering documents, making phone calls, preparing for the next phase of the operation. Malcolm watched them for a moment, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. This was a good team, a strong team, and he knew they were up to the challenge. As he turned back to his own notes, his mind was already racing ahead, planning the next steps, anticipating the obstacles they would face. He knew it wouldn't be easy. Collins was a formidable opponent, and there would be resistance from within the precinct, from officers who were loyal to him, who feared what would happen if the truth came out. But Malcolm was ready. He had faced down worse, had taken on corrupt politicians, ruthless gang leaders, and even his own colleagues when it was necessary. He wasn't afraid of Collins or his network of cronies. He knew what needed to be done, and he would see it through to the end. The door to the conference room opened, and an agent stepped inside, a thick folder in his hands. "Agent Gray, we've got more intel from Perkins's precinct. You're going to want to see this." Malcolm nodded, his gaze sharp and focused. "Bring it here." As the agent handed over the folder, Malcolm felt a surge of determination. This was it, the information they needed, the evidence that would bring everything crashing down. He flipped open the folder, his eyes scanning the pages, a grim smile forming on his lips. "Perfect," he murmured, his voice low but fierce. "This is exactly what we need." He glanced up at Rachel, who was watching him intently. "Get the team ready. We're moving on Perkins tonight." Rachel nodded, her expression serious. "Understood. I'll have the team prepped in 10. Malcolm watched as she moved to rally the agents, his mind already focused on the next steps. They were on the verge of something big, something that would change everything, and he was ready. As the room buzzed with activity, Malcolm turned his attention back to the folder, his heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and resolve. They had the evidence, they had the team, and they had the determination to see this through. Collins wouldn't know what hit him. Sam sat on the narrow metal bench in his holding cell, his elbows resting on his knees, his head hanging low. The cold, unyielding walls felt like they were closing in on him, every sound in the echoing corridor outside, reminding him of where he was and what he had become. His mind raced with fragments of memories, conversations, and regrets, each one more painful than the last. He ran a hand through his hair, the weight of the cuffs gone but the sensation still lingering. His wrists sore and red. His eyes were dry and burning. He had been staring at the same spot on the floor for what felt like hours, trying to make sense of it all. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Malcolm's face, calm and unflinching, and heard his voice, those damning words replaying in his mind. "Your job is to serve and protect, not to judge and punish." Sam squeezed his eyes shut, his fists clenching tightly. How had he gotten here? How had everything gone so wrong? He had always believed he was doing the right thing, that he was protecting the community, keeping order. But now, sitting here, it all seemed so twisted, so horribly distorted. A sharp knock on the door made him flinch. He looked up as the door swung open, revealing an FBI agent he hadn't seen before. The man was tall and serious-looking, with close-cropped hair and an unreadable expression. "Officer Perkins," the agent said, his tone brisk. "I'm Agent Carter. I'm here to escort you to the interrogation room." Sam felt his stomach drop. Interrogation. The word hung in the air, heavy and ominous. He knew this was coming, knew that they would want answers. But it didn't make it any easier. Slowly, he pushed himself to his feet, his legs feeling weak and unsteady. "Let's go," Carter said, stepping aside and gesturing towards the open door. Sam took a deep breath, then stepped forward, his heart pounding. As he walked down the long, sterile corridor, he could feel the eyes of the guards and agents on him, their gazes filled with curiosity and judgment. He kept his head down, his mind a swirling mess of fear and uncertainty. The interrogation room was stark and bare. A single table with 2 chairs facing each other. A camera was mounted in the corner, its lens pointed directly at the empty seat on one side of the table. The overhead lights cast a harsh, unflattering glow, making the room feel even colder. Carter gestured for Sam to sit, then took a seat across from him. He placed a file on the table, his expression calm and professional. "Officer Perkins," he began, his voice steady, "we're going to have a conversation. You're not under arrest at this moment, but we need to discuss your actions and what you know about the activities in your precinct." Sam nodded numbly, his throat tight. I'll answer your questions," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Carter opened the file, glancing down at the papers inside. "Let's start with tonight. You encountered Special Agent Malcolm Gray outside the boutique. What were you thinking when you decided to confront him?" Sam's mouth went dry. He looked down at his hands, his fingers twisting together. I thought he was up to something," he admitted. "He was just standing there, and it didn't seem right. I thought he might be planning to break in." Carter nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving Sam's face. "And why did you think that?" Sam swallowed hard, his mind flashing back to the moment he had seen Malcolm standing there. The way his presence had immediately triggered a sense of suspicion, of threat. "I don't know," he whispered, shame flooding him. I assumed." "You assumed because he was a black man in a wealthy neighborhood," Carter said bluntly. "You didn't ask questions, didn't try to understand the situation. You just acted on your assumptions." Sam flinched at the harsh truth in Carter's words. He knew it was true, but hearing it spoken so plainly, so unequivocally, was like a punch to the gut. "I was wrong," he said, his voice cracking. "I see that now. I shouldn't have done any of it." Carter leaned back in his chair, his gaze assessing. "It's good that you recognize that, Officer Perkins. But recognizing it now doesn't change what happened. And it doesn't change the fact that this isn't an isolated incident. We've reviewed your record. This isn't the first time you've used excessive force. Isn't the first time you've let your assumptions guide your actions." Sam's heart sank. He had known this was coming, known that his past would catch up with him. But hearing it laid out like this, hearing the cold, clinical recounting of his failures, was almost unbearable. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," he said desperately, his voice trembling. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was protecting people. Protecting who? Carter asked sharply. The people in the neighborhood? Or yourself? Your sense of authority? Your control? Sam's head bowed, his shoulders slumping. He didn't have an answer to that, not one that made sense anymore. Everything he had believed in, everything he had convinced himself was right, was crumbling away, leaving him hollow and lost. Carter sighed softly, his tone softening just a fraction. Look, Officer Perkins, we're not here to destroy your life. We're here to get to the truth, to expose what's been happening in your precinct. You're not the only one who's made these kinds of mistakes, but you're the one sitting here right now. You have a chance to help us make this right. Sam looked up, his eyes filled with uncertainty. What do you want from me? He asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. We want your cooperation, Carter said simply. We want you to tell us what you know about the other officers, about Captain Collins, about anyone else who's been involved in misconduct or corruption. We need names, dates, incidents, everything. Sam's heart pounded in his chest. He thought about the other officers, the ones who had been his friends, his colleagues. He thought about the times they had laughed together, had backed each other up, had assured each other that they were doing what needed to be done. I can't just turn on them, he murmured, his voice shaking. They're like family. Family doesn't let you destroy yourself, Carter said sharply. Family doesn't encourage you to break the law, to hurt people. The people you think of as family have been using you, Perkins. They've been using your aggression, your need to prove yourself, to serve their own ends. And now they're going to throw you to the wolves if it means saving themselves. Sam's breath hitched. He felt like he was being torn apart, his loyalty to his colleagues, to the only people who had ever made him feel like he belonged, clashing violently with the stark reality of what he had done, what they had all done. You have to make a choice, Carter said quietly. You can protect them, and you can go down with them, or you can help us, and maybe, just maybe, you can find a way to make this right. Sam closed his eyes, his heart aching. He thought about his career, about the years he had spent building his reputation, about the pride he had felt every time he put on his uniform. He thought about the people he had hurt, the people he had dismissed and judged without ever really seeing them. I don't know if I can do it, he whispered, his voice filled with anguish. I don't know if I can turn on them. Carter leaned forward, his gaze intense. You're not turning on them, Officer Perkins. You're standing up for what's right. You're standing up for the people who couldn't stand up for themselves. You have a chance to be part of something bigger than yourself, to help us clean up this mess, to make a real difference. Sam's hands trembled as he ran them through his hair. He felt like he was drowning, caught in a current of emotions that threatened to pull him under. He didn't know what to do, didn't know how to find his way through the storm that raged inside him. But then he remembered Malcolm's words, that quiet, unyielding voice that had cut through his panic and fear. This is your last chance to do the right thing. He took a deep, shuddering breath and looked up at Carter, his eyes filled with determination and fear. Okay, he said softly. I'll help you. I don't know how much I can give you, but I'll try. Carter nodded, his expression serious but approving. That's all we're asking, Officer Perkins. Just try. As Carter began asking questions, his voice steady and calm, Sam felt the weight of his decision settle over him. It wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to erase what he had done. Wasn't going to make the pain and guilt go away. But maybe, just maybe, it was a step towards something better, something that could begin to heal the wounds he had helped create. And as he spoke, as he began to share what he knew, he felt a small, tentative hope take root inside him. It was fragile, uncertain, but it was there, a tiny spark in the darkness that surrounded him. Sam sat hunched over on the edge of the metal bench in his cell, staring blankly at the floor. The walls seemed to close in on him, the cold, sterile air suffocating. He had lost all sense of time, his thoughts consumed by the mess he had made of his life. The hours he had spent in the interrogation room with Agent Carter played over and over in his mind. He had talked, more than he thought he ever would, naming officers, describing incidents, spilling secrets he had sworn he would never reveal. But instead of relief, all he felt was guilt. He had betrayed the people he'd once called friends, his colleagues, and himself. He had hoped that talking would bring some kind of peace, but it only deepened the pit of regret that seemed to be swallowing him whole. The cell door creaked open, and Sam looked up, his heart racing. Malcolm stepped inside, his expression calm but serious. He closed the door behind him and took a moment to study Sam, his gaze piercing and thoughtful. Officer Perkins, Malcolm said quietly, his voice steady. I hear you've been cooperating. Sam nodded slowly, his voice coming out hoarse. Yeah, I told them everything I could remember. Malcolm pulled up a chair and sat down across from Sam, his eyes never leaving his face. You gave us a lot of valuable information. You helped us connect the dots on several officers we've been watching for a long time. That's a good step. Sam swallowed hard. I just wanted to do something right for once. Malcolm's gaze softened. Just a fraction. That's a start, Sam. But you need to understand that talking now doesn't erase what you've done. Sam looked down at his hands, his fingers twisting together. I know, he whispered. I know I can't take it back, but I had to try, didn't I? I had to do something. Malcolm leaned forward slightly, his tone firm, but not unkind. You did. And because of what you've told us, we can go after some of the worst offenders in your precinct. Captain Collins, Lieutenant Harris, they're going to face justice. And you had a part in that. Sam's heart pounded in his chest. The names he had given, the stories he had shared, they felt like a betrayal, but also like a burden lifted. He had carried those secrets for so long, had convinced himself they were necessary, but now, with them laid bare, he could see the damage they had done, to him, to others, to everyone involved. But what happens to me? He asked, his voice trembling. I know I'm not getting off easy. Malcolm sighed, his expression thoughtful. You're not. What you've done, the choices you made, those have consequences. You used your position to hurt people, to intimidate, to abuse your authority. You can't just walk away from that. Sam nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping. I know. I deserve whatever comes. I don't want to be that person anymore. Malcolm's gaze was steady, assessing. And what kind of person do you want to be? Sam hesitated, his mind racing. He thought about the years he had spent justifying his actions, convincing himself that he was doing the right thing. He thought about the people he had hurt, the lives he had damaged. I want to be better, he said finally, his voice quiet, but firm. I don't know if I can make up for what I did, but I want to try. Malcolm leaned back, studying Sam closely. Cooperating with us is a start. The information you've provided is going to help bring down a lot of people who've been hurting this community for a long time. That's something, Sam. It doesn't erase the past, but it's something. Sam looked up, a flicker of hope sparking in his eyes. Does that mean I have a chance? A chance to do something good? To make things right? Malcolm's expression was guarded, but there was a hint of warmth in his eyes. It means that you've shown a willingness to change. That counts for something. It doesn't mean you're off the hook. You're still going to face charges, and there will still be consequences. But the fact that you've cooperated will be taken into consideration. Sam nodded, a wave of relief washing over him. It wasn't a get-out-of-jail-free card, but it was something. He had spent so long feeling trapped, boxed in by his own mistakes, his own choices. Now, for the first time, he felt like there might be a way forward, a way to start rebuilding, even if it was only a small step. Malcolm glanced at his watch, then looked back at Sam. There's still a lot of work to be done. You've given us a lot, but we need to make sure we can use everything you've told us. That means you'll need to testify, to stand by what you've said. Sam's stomach twisted at the thought of facing the people he had named, of standing in court and repeating everything he had confessed. But he nodded slowly, his resolve hardening. I'll do it. I'll testify. Malcolm nodded, a hint of respect in his eyes. Good. That's the right choice. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between them. Sam could feel the guilt still gnawing at him, the regret for the choices he had made, the people he had hurt. But there was also a sliver of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to make amends. I know I can't fix everything, Sam said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. But I'm going to do whatever I can to help now. Malcolm studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. That's all you can do, Sam. It's not about fixing everything. It's about taking responsibility and trying to make things right, even if it's just a little bit at a time. Sam swallowed hard, his heart pounding. He still didn't know what the future held, didn't know if he would ever be able to make up for what he had done. But he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to run from it anymore. He was going to face it, whatever it took. Malcolm stood up, his gaze steady. I'll be in touch. We'll work out the details of your testimony, and we'll make sure you're prepared for what's coming. Sam nodded, his throat tight. Thank you, he said quietly, for giving me a chance. Malcolm's expression softened, just a fraction. You earned it by stepping up. Just remember, this is only the beginning. You've got a long way to go. With that, he turned and knocked on the door. The guard opened it, and Malcolm stepped out, pausing for a moment to look back at Sam. Stay strong, Sam, he said quietly. You're doing the right thing now. Keep doing it. The door closed, the sound echoing in the small cell. Sam sat there, his heart pounding, his mind racing. He knew he still had a lot to face, a lot to answer for. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was facing it head-on, not hiding, not running. It wasn't redemption, not yet, but it was a start. And for now, that was enough. The holding cell felt colder now, the silence around Sam heavy and oppressive. He sat on the metal bench, staring at his hands. They still felt numb from the cuffs, a physical reminder of everything that had happened, everything he had done. He'd been up all night, his mind replaying the scenes from the interrogation, the names he had given, the faces of the people he'd betrayed. His career was over, his life shattered. He had turned on everyone he had known, on everything he had believed in. He thought about Malcolm's visit, the way the FBI agent had spoken to him, not with the anger or hatred he had expected, but with a cold, hard truth that had pierced through his defenses. Malcolm hadn't offered forgiveness or sympathy. He had simply laid out the facts, forcing Sam to face the consequences of his actions. And now, even with the slight relief of cooperation, the weight of his guilt felt crushing. The door opened, and a guard stepped in, nodding at him. "Perkins, you have a visitor." Sam looked up, his heart pounding. He wasn't sure who he expected, maybe a lawyer or another agent. But as he stood up and followed the guard down the narrow hallway, his stomach twisted with anxiety. They stopped in front of a small, dimly lit room with a single table and 2 chairs. As Sam stepped inside, he froze. Sitting across from the table was his wife, Emily. Her face was pale, her eyes red from crying. She looked up as he entered, her expression a mixture of anger, sadness, and something else, something that made his chest tighten painfully. "Emily," he whispered, his voice hoarse. I didn't think you'd come." She stood up, her hands clenched at her sides. "I had to," she said, her voice trembling. "I needed to see you, to hear it from you." "What happened, Sam? What did you do?" Sam felt his heart drop. He had been dreading this moment, the moment when he would have to explain everything, to admit to her the person he had become. He took a deep breath, his hands shaking. "I made a mistake," he said quietly, his voice filled with regret. I let things get out of control. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I wasn't. I hurt people, Emily. I used my position to do things I shouldn't have, things I'm not proud of." Emily's eyes filled with tears, but she held his gaze. "How could you? How could you let it go so far?" Sam looked down, his shoulders slumping. "I don't know. I got caught up in it, in the power, in the feeling that I was the one who had to keep things under control. I thought I was protecting people, but I wasn't. I was just trying to hold on to something, trying to prove something to myself." Emily's voice broke, her words filled with pain. "Do you know what this has done to us? To our family? Our kids are asking questions I don't know how to answer. People are talking, Sam. Everyone is talking." Sam felt a sharp stab of guilt. He hadn't thought about what this would mean for his family, for Emily and their children. He had been so consumed by his own actions, his own fear and guilt, that he had forgotten how much this would hurt them too. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice shaking. "I'm so sorry, Emily. I never wanted this. I never wanted to hurt you or the kids." Emily shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Sorry doesn't change what's happened, Sam. Sorry doesn't fix this." "I know," Sam said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know it doesn't, but I'm trying to make things right now. I'm cooperating with the FBI. I'm telling them everything I know. I know it won't change what I've done, but it's all I can do." Emily looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "Is that why you're doing this? Because you think it'll fix things?" Sam shook his head, his throat tightening. "No, I'm doing it because it's the only thing I have left. I can't change what I did, but I can at least try to help stop the people who are still hurting others. I can try to do something good, even if it's just a little." Emily sat down slowly, her hands shaking. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Sam. I don't know if I can ever get past this." Sam felt his heart break at her words. "I understand," he said softly. "I don't expect you to. I needed you to know that I'm trying, that I'm not running from this." They sat in silence for a long moment, the pain and uncertainty hanging heavy between them. Sam could see the conflict in Emily's eyes, the way she wanted to reach out to him but couldn't, the way she was struggling to reconcile the man she had married with the man sitting in front of her now. Finally, Emily took a deep breath, wiping her tears away. "What happens next?" Sam looked down at his hands. "I don't know. There's going to be a trial and I'm going to testify. I'll probably go to prison for a while, but I'm going to do everything I can to help the investigation, to make sure the people who were really running things get taken down." Emily nodded slowly, her gaze distant. "And after that?" Sam shook his head, his voice breaking. "I don't know, Emily. I don't know what's going to happen. But I want you to know that I'm sorry for everything. I know that doesn't make it better, but I am." She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes filled with pain and uncertainty. "I don't know if I can do this, Sam. I don't know if I can keep doing this." Sam felt a surge of panic. "Please, Emily, don't give up on us. I know I've messed up. I know I've done terrible things, but please, don't give up on me." Emily's voice was soft, barely above a whisper. "I don't know, Sam. I need time. Sam nodded, his heart aching. I understand. I'll wait. I'll do whatever it takes. Emily stood up, her expression distant. I have to go. The kids, they're with my parents, but I need to get back to them. Sam stood as well, his legs feeling weak and unsteady. Thank you for coming, he said quietly. I know it wasn't easy. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a pain that cut deeper than anything he had ever felt. I needed to see you, to hear it from you, but I don't know what happens now, Sam. I just don't. With that, she turned and walked towards the door. Sam watched her go, his heart breaking with every step she took. The door closed behind her, the sound echoing in the small room, and Sam sank back down onto the bench, his hands covering his face. He had known that this would be hard, that he would have to face the consequences of his actions, but he hadn't realized how much it would hurt to see the pain he had caused reflected in Emily's eyes. He had lost so much, his career, his freedom, his reputation, and now he was on the verge of losing his family too. The cell door opened again, and the guard stepped inside. Time's up, Perkins. Let's go. Sam nodded numbly and followed the guard back to his cell. As he sat down on the cold metal bench, he felt the weight of everything pressing down on him. The guilt, the regret, the uncertainty. He didn't know what the future held, didn't know if he would ever be able to make things right with Emily, with his kids, with himself. But he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't go back to who he had been. He couldn't keep pretending that what he had done was justified, that he had been protecting something worth protecting. He had to face the truth, had to face the consequences, no matter how painful they were. He took a deep breath, his heart pounding painfully in his chest. He had made his choices, had taken his steps towards redemption, however small they might be. Now, all he could do was wait and hope that it would be enough to at least start healing the wounds he had caused. And as he sat there, alone in the silence of his cell, he felt a small, tentative resolve take root inside him. He wasn't asking for forgiveness, wasn't expecting redemption, but he would keep trying, keep doing what he could to help, to make amends, because it was all he had left. The holding cell felt like a tomb. Sam sat on the cold metal bench, staring blankly at the wall, his thoughts tangled and heavy. He had spent days in a haze, reliving every moment of his downfall, every mistake that had led him here. Each hour felt like a punishment, each minute a reminder of what he had lost. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, breaking the oppressive silence. Sam lifted his head, his heart pounding. He had almost forgotten what it felt like to expect something other than dread. The footsteps grew louder, and then the cell door swung open. Malcolm Gray stepped inside, his expression unreadable. He stood there for a moment, his gaze fixed on Sam. Then he pulled up a chair and sat down across from him, his eyes sharp and assessing. Sam, Malcolm said quietly, his voice steady. We need to talk. Sam's heart sank. He knew what this was about. The trial was coming up and he would have to testify. He had agreed to it, had promised to do whatever he could to help bring down the corrupt officers in his precinct, but the thought of facing them in court, of standing up and speaking out, filled him with dread. I know, Sam muttered, his voice rough. I'm ready to do it. Malcolm studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. Good, because we need you to be. You're a key witness, Sam. What you say in that courtroom will determine whether we can bring down Collins and his men. Sam felt a surge of fear. The weight of it all pressed down on him, the realization that his words could change everything. He had already turned on his colleagues, had already given up everything he had known, and now he was about to face them, to testify against them in open court. I'll do it, he said, his voice shaking slightly. I know what I have to say. I'll tell the truth. Malcolm nodded, his gaze never leaving Sam's face. I believe you, but it's not just about telling the truth, Sam. It's about being strong, about not letting them intimidate you. You're going to be under a lot of pressure in that courtroom. They're going to try to break you, to discredit you. You need to be prepared for that. Sam swallowed hard, his mouth dry. He knew what Malcolm was saying, knew that the defense attorneys would try to tear him apart, to paint him as the villain, as a liar. He would be their scapegoat, the one they would blame for everything. And part of him knew they wouldn't be entirely wrong. I'm scared, Sam admitted, his voice barely more than a whisper. I've never been this scared in my life. Malcolm's expression softened, but his tone remained firm. I know, but you've come this far. You've already done the hardest part, admitting what you did, cooperating with us. This is just one more step. Sam looked down at his hands, his fingers twisting together. What happens after? After the trial? Malcolm leaned back, his gaze thoughtful. That depends. If your testimony helps us take down Collins and the others, it'll make a difference. The judge will take that into account when it comes to sentencing. Sam's heart pounded. Sentencing. The word hung in the air, heavy and terrifying. He knew he wouldn't walk away from this without consequences. knew that prison was a very real possibility, but he had made his choice. He would face whatever came, because he knew it was the only way to start making things right. "I don't know if I can do it," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I don't know if I'm strong enough." Malcolm's gaze was intense, his voice steady. "You can. You've already shown that. You stood up and did the right thing when it mattered, even though it cost you everything. That takes strength, Sam, more than you know." Sam looked up at him, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "Do you really think it'll matter, what I say?" Malcolm nodded, his expression serious. "I do. You were part of their inner circle, part of the system they used to control that precinct. Your testimony will show how deep the corruption went, how many people were hurt because of their actions. It's important, Sam. It matters." Sam took a deep, shuddering breath. He had spent so long feeling helpless, feeling like he was trapped in a nightmare of his own making. But now, for the first time, he felt like he had some control, like he could do something that mattered, something that would make a difference. "I'll do it," he said firmly, his voice steady. "I'll testify." Malcolm's gaze softened slightly. "I know you will, and you're not alone in this. We'll be there with you every step of the way." Sam nodded, a tight knot of fear and determination settling in his chest. He knew it wouldn't be easy. He knew that standing up in that courtroom, facing the people he had once called friends, would be one of the hardest things he had ever done. But he also knew it was necessary. He couldn't undo the past, but he could at least help build a better future. Malcolm stood up, his expression thoughtful. "There's something else I need to tell you, Sam." Sam's heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" Malcolm hesitated, then looked directly at him. "Emily and the kids, they're being looked after. I know things are tough right now, but they're safe. Emily is taking this one day at a time, and she's strong." Sam felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of relief and guilt. He had thought about Emily and the kids constantly, had worried about what would happen to them, about what he had put them through. Hearing that they were being looked after, that they were safe, was a small comfort. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for looking out for them." Malcolm nodded. "They're going to be okay, but they need you to be strong, Sam. They need you to get through this." Sam swallowed hard, his eyes stinging with unshed tears. He had lost so much: his career, his freedom, his self-respect. But his family, the thought of them, gave him something to hold on to, something to fight for. "I will," he said quietly, his voice filled with determination. "I'll get through this, for them." Malcolm looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Good. Keep that in mind when you're on that stand. Remember who you're doing this for." Sam nodded, his resolve hardening. He would face whatever came, would stand up and tell the truth, not just for himself, but for his family, for the people who had been hurt by the corruption he had been a part of. It was the only way forward, the only way he could start to make things right. As Malcolm turned to leave, he paused at the door, looking back at Sam. "We'll be in touch soon to go over your testimony. Stay strong, Sam. You're doing the right thing." The door closed behind him, and Sam sat there, his heart pounding, his mind racing. He still didn't know what the future held, still didn't know what would happen after the trial, but he knew one thing for certain. He was going to face it, whatever it took. He wasn't looking for redemption, wasn't asking for forgiveness. He knew he had a long road ahead, knew that there would be consequences for what he had done, but he also knew that he couldn't run from it anymore. He would stand up, he would testify, and he would face the truth of his actions, because it was the only way forward. And for the first time in a long time, he felt a small, fragile sense of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to keep going, enough to keep fighting, enough to start over, whatever that might mean. Malcolm Gray sat at the head of the conference table, his gaze focused on the documents spread out before him. The early morning light filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows across the room. He glanced up as Detective Rachel Morgan entered, followed by Agent Carter. Both wore the same expression of determination and fatigue that had become familiar to everyone involved in this case. "This is it, Malcolm," Rachel said, dropping a thick file onto the table. "We've got everything we need. Sam Perkins has given us more than we could have hoped for." Malcolm nodded, his jaw tight. He had spent months piecing together the case against Captain Collins and his network of corrupt officers. They had been a scourge on the community for too long, using their badges to intimidate, to control, to destroy lives. And now, finally, they had the evidence to bring them down. "Perkins's testimony is solid?" Malcolm asked, his voice steady. Rachel took a seat across from him, flipping open the file. "Solid as it can be. He's named names, given us dates, specific incidents. We've corroborated as much as we can with other sources and surveillance. He's scared, but he's willing to testify. It's the best chance we've got." Malcolm leaned back, his eyes narrowing thoughtfully. He had known from the start that Perkins would be a difficult asset to manage. The man had been complicit in so much, had crossed so many lines, but he had also seen the fear and guilt in Sam's eyes, the realization that he had been used, that he had been part of something far worse than he had ever imagined. "Do you think he'll hold up on the stand?" Malcolm asked quietly. Rachel shrugged, her expression thoughtful. "He's fragile, but I think he'll do it. He's desperate to make amends, to prove that he's not just another dirty cop. He knows this is his only shot at something resembling redemption." Malcolm frowned, a knot of unease forming in his chest. Redemption. It was a word that got thrown around a lot in cases like this, as if a few good deeds could wipe away years of wrongdoing. But he knew better. He had seen too many people try to bargain their way to forgiveness, try to use their last-minute confessions as a shield against the consequences of their actions. "Redemption isn't what he's going to find," Malcolm said, his voice firm. "He needs to understand that. This is about justice, about holding people accountable. He's not getting a clean slate." Rachel's eyes softened slightly. "I think he knows that. He's not expecting to walk away from this without facing consequences. But he's trying, Malcolm. He's trying to do the right thing, even if it's just for the first time in his life." Malcolm sighed, running a hand over his face. He wanted to believe that Sam Perkins could change, that he could be more than the man who had abused his power, who had stood by while others suffered. But he also knew that it was too late for Sam to truly atone. The damage had been done, and no amount of cooperation would undo it. "We'll see," he said finally. "For now, we need to make sure his testimony is airtight. Collins is going to throw everything he has at us. He's going to try to discredit Perkins, to make him look like a liar, a traitor. We need to be ready for that." Rachel nodded, her gaze serious. "I'll go over everything with Sam again, make sure he's prepared for the cross-examination. We can't afford any surprises." Malcolm watched her for a moment, his mind racing. He had been working this case for so long, had seen so many people hurt by the corruption that had taken root in the precinct. This was their chance to make a real difference, to bring some measure of justice to the community. But he knew how fragile that chance was, how easily it could all fall apart. "Do we have everything we need on Collins?" he asked, his voice low. Rachel glanced at Carter, who nodded. "We do. Perkins's testimony ties everything together. The surveillance, the financial records, the statements from other officers. It all points to Collins as the mastermind behind the whole operation." Malcolm's jaw tightened. "Good. Then let's make sure we nail him. I don't want him slipping through the cracks because of some technicality or because Perkins wavers on the stand." Carter leaned forward, his expression grim. "He won't slip through, Malcolm. We've got him. And Perkins, he knows what's at stake. He's scared, but he's committed." Malcolm nodded, though the unease in his chest didn't lessen. He knew how high the stakes were, knew that this trial was about more than just one man. It was about sending a message, about showing that no one was above the law, that the system could still work, even when it seemed broken beyond repair. "Let's go over it again," he said, his voice steady. "Every detail. I want to make sure there are no gaps, no weaknesses they can exploit." They spent the next hour reviewing Perkins's testimony, going over each incident, each name, each piece of evidence. Malcolm listened carefully, his mind sharp, catching every inconsistency, every potential weak spot. He knew how ruthless Collins's defense would be, knew they would do everything in their power to discredit Perkins, to paint him as a liar, a man trying to save his own skin. When they finally finished, Malcolm sat back, his eyes tired but determined. "This has to work," he said quietly. "We can't let them get away with this." Rachel nodded, her expression fierce. "They won't. We've got them, Malcolm. Collins and his people are going down." Malcolm took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He had been here before, had fought battles that felt just as important, just as desperate. But this one felt different. This was about more than just one corrupt precinct, more than just a few bad cops. This was about restoring faith in the system, about showing that there was still justice, still accountability. "Let's make sure of it," he said finally. "No mistakes. No loose ends." Rachel and Carter nodded, gathering their files. As they stood to leave, Rachel glanced back at Malcolm, her eyes thoughtful. "What about Perkins?" she asked quietly. "What happens to him?" Malcolm hesitated, his mind racing. He had seen men like Perkins before, men who had done terrible things, but who, at the last moment, had tried to change, had tried to do something good. It didn't erase their crimes, didn't undo the harm they had caused, but it mattered. It had to matter. "He'll still face the consequences," Malcolm said finally, his voice firm. "He's not walking away from this clean, but his cooperation will count for something. It has to." Rachel nodded, her gaze steady. "I hope you're right." Malcolm watched as they left, his mind churning. He knew that there were no easy answers here, no simple resolutions. Sam Perkins was a flawed man, a man who had made terrible choices, who had hurt people because he could. But he was also a man who had chosen, at the last moment, to do the right thing, to help bring down the people who had led him astray. It wasn't redemption, it wasn't forgiveness, but it was something. Malcolm stood and walked to the window, staring out at the city below. He thought about the people who had been hurt by Collins and his network, the lives that had been destroyed by their greed and cruelty. He thought about the officers who had tried to do the right thing, who had stood up and spoken out, even when it put them at risk. And he thought about Sam Perkins, sitting in his cell, waiting to face the consequences of his actions. It was a complicated kind of justice, a tangled web of guilt and responsibility, but it was all they had. Malcolm took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. He would see this through, would make sure that Collins and his people faced justice, that the community got the answers and the accountability they deserved, because in the end, that was what mattered. Not redemption, not forgiveness, just justice. He turned away from the window, his mind clear and focused. They had a case to win, a system to fix, and a message to send, and he would do whatever it took to see it through. Malcolm stood in the hallway outside the courtroom, his heart pounding in his chest. He had been through dozens of trials, had faced down criminals and corruption more times than he could count, but this case felt different. It was more than just about taking down a corrupt precinct. It was about restoring faith in a system that had failed so many people for so long. He glanced down the hall and saw Sam Perkins standing with his attorney. Sam looked pale and nervous, his hands twitching at his sides. Malcolm could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes kept darting around as if he were searching for an escape. He knew how much this moment weighed on Sam, knew the fear and guilt that had brought him to this point. Rachel approached from the other side of the hallway, her expression tense. "They're ready to start," she said quietly, handing Malcolm a folder with the day's proceedings outlined. Malcolm nodded, his gaze still on Sam. "How's he holding up?" Rachel glanced at Sam, then back at Malcolm. "He's scared. I think he's really grasping what this means now, but he's going to testify. He knows he has to." Malcolm took a deep breath, feeling the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. He's going to be under a lot of pressure. Collins's lawyer is going to try to rip him apart, make him look like a liar. Rachel nodded, her expression grim. "We've prepped him as much as we can. It's up to him now." Malcolm looked back at Sam, his mind racing. He had spent months working with the man, watching as he struggled with the reality of his actions, with the knowledge that he had helped destroy lives. Sam had made mistakes, had done things that couldn't be undone, but he had also made the decision to come forward, to cooperate, to help bring down the people who had led him astray. "It's time," Rachel said softly. Malcolm took one last look at Sam, then turned and walked towards the courtroom door. As he stepped inside, the low hum of voices stilled, and all eyes turned towards him. The room was packed, reporters, community members, even off-duty officers, all watching and waiting for what was about to unfold. At the front of the room, Collins sat at the defense table, his expression calm, almost smug. He wore his usual air of confidence, the look of a man who believed he was untouchable. Beside him, his attorney, a sharp-eyed woman with a reputation for dismantling witnesses, whispered something in his ear. Malcolm's jaw tightened. He knew what they were up against. Collins had powerful allies, people who had helped shield him from scrutiny for years, but this time was different. This time, they had the evidence, the witnesses, the testimonies that would tear down the walls of protection that had kept Collins safe. The judge entered, and everyone rose. Malcolm took his seat at the prosecution table, his mind focused and clear. He knew what he had to do. He knew what was at stake. The proceedings began, the opening statements laying out the case. Malcolm listened as the defense tried to paint Collins as a dedicated officer, a victim of overzealous investigators and disgruntled subordinates. It was the same tired story, the same lies they had been telling for years. But this time, Malcolm knew, they wouldn't hold up. After the opening statements, the prosecution began calling their witnesses. One by one, officers and community members took the stand, detailing the corruption and abuse that had plagued the precinct. Malcolm watched as each witness testified, his heart pounding with every word. They were building their case, piece by piece, brick by brick. Then it was Sam's turn. Malcolm watched as Sam walked to the stand, his steps hesitant, his face pale. He looked like a man walking to his execution. As he took his seat, Malcolm could see the fear in his eyes, the way his hands gripped the edges of the chair as if holding on for dear life. The prosecutor, a calm, steady man named Jonathan Reed, stepped forward. "Mr. Perkins, thank you for being here today. I know this is difficult, but your testimony is crucial to this case." Sam nodded, his voice barely audible. "I understand." Reed began with the basics. asking Sam to describe his role in the precinct, his relationship with Collins and the other officers. Sam answered quietly, his voice trembling but steady. He talked about the camaraderie, the unspoken rules, the way Collins had encouraged them to use their power, to push the limits. "And did you ever witness Captain Collins give orders that you knew were against regulations?" Reed asked, his voice calm and clear. Sam hesitated, his eyes flicking to Collins, who sat watching him with an intense, almost predatory gaze. "Yes," he said finally, his voice barely more than a whisper. "He gave orders to cover up complaints, to intimidate witnesses. He encouraged us to use force, to target certain people." Malcolm felt a surge of relief. Sam was holding up, was telling the truth, even under the weight of Collins' gaze. He knew how much it cost Sam to admit these things, to stand up and expose the corruption he had been part of. Reed continued, guiding Sam through his testimony, drawing out the details of each incident, each order given, each line crossed. Sam's voice grew steadier as he spoke, the fear in his eyes giving way to something else, something like resolve. Then it was the defense's turn. Collins's attorney stood, her expression sharp and focused. She approached the stand slowly, her gaze locked on Sam. "Mr. Perkins," she began, her voice smooth and measured, "you've admitted to participating in these actions, haven't you?" Sam nodded, his hands gripping the edges of the chair. "Yes. You've admitted to using excessive force, to intimidating people, to covering up complaints. Isn't that correct?" "Yes. And now, after all this time, you're trying to tell us that you're the hero? That you're the one who's going to clean up this precinct?" Malcolm felt a surge of anger. He knew what she was doing, knew that she was trying to paint Sam as a liar, as a man who was only talking now to save himself. But he also knew that Sam had come to this point because he had realized the truth, because he had decided to stand up and take responsibility. "I'm not a hero," Sam said quietly, his voice trembling but clear. "I did terrible things. I hurt people, but I'm trying to make it right now." The attorney's eyes narrowed. "Make it right? By turning on your colleagues? By betraying the people you worked with?" Sam flinched, but he didn't look away. "They weren't protecting people. They were hurting them. And I was part of that, but I'm not going to lie about it anymore." The attorney leaned closer, her voice sharp. "You expect us to believe that you've suddenly grown a conscience? That you're not just doing this to save yourself?" Malcolm held his breath, his hands clenched on the table. This was the moment. This was where Sam had to stand firm, had to show that he wasn't just talking to save himself, that he understood the gravity of what he had done. Sam took a deep breath, his eyes meeting the attorney's. "I don't expect anyone to believe me. I know what I did. I know I'm going to face consequences for it. But I'm not doing this to save myself. I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do. Because I have to live with what I've done." There was a murmur in the courtroom, a ripple of reaction. Malcolm felt a surge of pride. Sam was holding his ground, was telling the truth, even when it cost him everything. The attorney narrowed her eyes. "And you're willing to face the consequences no matter what they are?" "Yes," Sam said, his voice steady. "I'm willing to face whatever comes." The attorney stared at him for a long moment, then turned away, her face a mask of frustration. No further questions. Malcolm let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Sam had done it. He had stood up and told the truth, had faced the defense's attempts to tear him down, and had stayed firm. As Sam left the stand, Malcolm caught his eye and nodded, a brief but heartfelt gesture of acknowledgement. Sam had done what he needed to do, had played his part in bringing down the people who had destroyed so many lives. The rest of the day passed in a blur of testimonies, evidence, and arguments. Malcolm watched as the prosecution built their case, as they laid out the facts, as they dismantled the lies and deceit that had protected Collins and his network for so long. When the judge finally called a recess, Malcolm stood, his body tense with exhaustion and relief. They had done it. They had made their case. Now it was up to the jury, up to the system that they had fought so hard to uphold. As he walked out of the courtroom, he saw Sam sitting alone on a bench in the hallway, his head in his hands. Malcolm hesitated, then walked over, his heart heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. "You did well, Sam," he said quietly, his voice steady. Sam looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. "I hope it's enough." Malcolm nodded slowly. "It is. You told the truth. That's all you could do." Sam nodded, his gaze distant. "I don't know what happens now." Malcolm looked at him, his heart aching for the man who had lost so much, who had made so many mistakes, but had tried, in the end, to do something right. "You face the consequences, Sam. But you did the right thing today. That matters." Sam looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I guess it's all I can do now." Malcolm nodded, his voice soft. "Yes, it is." As he turned and walked away, he felt a sense of closure, a sense that they had finally, After so much pain and struggle, done something that mattered. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't a victory that erased all the hurt, but it was something. And for now, that was enough. The courtroom was packed, a tense energy crackling through the air. Malcolm sat at the prosecution table, his heart pounding as he watched the jurors file back into their seats. The trial had been grueling. Days of testimony, cross-examinations, and relentless scrutiny. Now, it all came down to this moment. He glanced over at Sam, who sat alone in the witness box, his face drawn and pale. Malcolm could see the strain etched into every line of his features, the way his shoulders slumped under the weight of everything that had happened. Sam had held up on the stand, had faced down Collins's defense attorney with a resolve that had surprised everyone in the room. But now, as they waited for the verdict, he looked like a man barely holding himself together. Malcolm's gaze shifted to the defense table, where Captain Collins sat, his expression calm and composed. He had maintained that demeanor throughout the trial, his confidence never wavering, even as the prosecution laid out the mountain of evidence against him. His attorney, sharp and relentless, had done everything possible to discredit the witnesses, to cast doubt on the charges. But Malcolm knew the truth. Collins was guilty. He had orchestrated a campaign of fear and corruption that had destroyed lives and torn the community apart. The judge, a stern gray-haired woman who had presided over the trial with an iron will, called the court to order. The murmur of voices died down, and the room fell into a tense, expectant silence. "Members of the jury," the judge said, her voice clear and commanding. "Have you reached a verdict?" The foreman, a middle-aged man with a solemn expression, stood and faced the judge. "We have, Your Honor." Malcolm's heart hammered in his chest. This was it. Months of investigation, weeks of testimony, the countless hours spent piecing together the case. It all came down to this moment. He glanced at Rachel, who sat beside him, her face pale but steady. She gave him a small, tight nod. The judge turned to the foreman. "Please read the verdict." The foreman cleared his throat, unfolding a piece of paper. "In the case of the People versus Richard Collins, we find the defendant guilty on all counts." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. For a moment, there was silence, as if the entire room was holding its breath. Then a low murmur rippled through the crowd, a mix of relief, disbelief, and anger. Malcolm let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Guilty. They had done it. They had taken down a man who had terrorized the community, who had twisted the law to suit his own ends. It was a victory, but it felt strangely hollow. Collins sat still, his expression unchanged, as if the verdict hadn't touched him at all. Malcolm knew what was going through his mind. Men like Collins didn't believe they could be held accountable. Even now, he probably thought he could find a way out. An appeal, a deal. But this time, there would be no escape. The judge's gavel came down with a sharp crack. "The defendant is remanded into custody pending sentencing. Court is adjourned." People began to stand, the room filling with the hum of voices. Malcolm watched as Collins was led away in handcuffs, his head held high, his gaze defiant. It would be a long time before he saw freedom again, if ever. Malcolm felt a hand on his arm and turned to see Rachel, her expression a mix of exhaustion and satisfaction. "We did it," she said softly. "We actually did it." He nodded, but his gaze drifted back to Sam, who was still sitting in the witness box, staring down at his hands. "Yeah," he said quietly. "We did." As the courtroom emptied, Malcolm made his way over to Sam. The man looked up as he approached, his eyes red-rimmed and tired. "It's over, isn't it?" Sam asked, his voice raw. Malcolm nodded. "It's over. Collins is going to prison." "You helped make that happen?" Sam swallowed hard, his gaze dropping back to his hands. "I don't know if I feel any better." Malcolm sat down beside him, his voice gentle but firm. "You did the right thing, Sam. I know it doesn't take away what you did, but it means something. You stood up and told the truth. That's more than most people would have done." Sam nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping. "What happens to me now?" Malcolm hesitated. He knew that was the question Sam had been dreading, the question that had haunted him throughout the trial. Cooperating with the investigation had earned him some leniency, but it didn't erase the crimes he had committed. "You're still going to face charges," Malcolm said quietly. "You're not walking away from this. But the fact that you cooperated, that you testified, it'll be taken into account during sentencing." Sam closed his eyes, a shuddering breath escaping him. "I don't expect to get off easy," he whispered. I needed to do something right, for once." Malcolm watched him, feeling a strange mix of sympathy and frustration. He knew that Sam was genuinely remorseful, that he was trying to make amends. But he also knew that the damage Sam had done couldn't be undone, that the people he had hurt would carry those scars forever. "You did something right today," Malcolm said softly, "but you still have to pay for what you did. That's part of it too." Sam nodded, his expression resigned. I know. I'm ready to face it. Malcolm stood, his gaze steady on Sam's. It's not going to be easy, but you made a choice. You did the right thing when it mattered. That counts for something. Sam looked up at him, his eyes filled with a complicated mix of emotions. Thank you, Malcolm. For not giving up on me. Malcolm nodded, his voice quiet. Just keep doing what you're doing, Sam. Keep telling the truth. As he turned to leave, he heard Sam's voice, low and hesitant. Do you think I'll ever get to see my kids again? Malcolm paused, his heart aching at the pain in Sam's voice. I don't know, Sam, but I hope so. Keep doing the right thing, and maybe you'll get that chance. Sam nodded slowly, a faint glimmer of hope flickering in his eyes. Malcolm felt a pang of sympathy. He knew that Sam's road to redemption, if there even was one, would be long and difficult. But at least he was trying. At least he had taken the first step. Malcolm left the courtroom, stepping into the bright afternoon sun. He felt a strange sense of relief, mingled with exhaustion. They had won the case, had brought down one of the worst corrupt officers he had ever encountered. But there was still so much to do, so much work left to be done. He glanced back at the courthouse, thinking of Sam, of the lives that had been affected by Collins and his network. It wasn't a perfect victory, but it was a step in the right direction. As he walked towards his car, Malcolm felt a sense of purpose, of determination. There were more battles to fight, more people who needed help, more justice to be sought, and he would be there, every step of the way. Because in the end, that was all that mattered. Standing up, speaking out, and doing what was right, no matter how hard, no matter the cost. And he was ready for whatever came next. The sterile air of the courtroom seemed colder than usual as Sam sat at the defendant's table, his heart heavy with anticipation and dread. It had been weeks since the verdict against Collins, and now it was Sam's turn to face the judge, to hear the final judgment on his own actions. He glanced around the nearly empty room. There were no reporters, no spectators, just a few officers, his attorney, and Malcolm sitting silently in the back row. Malcolm's presence was both a comfort and a reminder of everything Sam had lost. He had expected anger, disdain, even hatred from the man who had led the investigation against him. Instead, he had found something unexpected, respect, tempered with a cold, hard acknowledgement of the consequences he had to face. Sam knew Malcolm wasn't here to support him, not exactly. He was here to make sure that justice, in whatever form it took, was served. The judge, a stern woman in her late 50s, entered the courtroom, and everyone rose. Her expression was unreadable as she took her seat, shuffling the papers before her. Sam's attorney, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a weary demeanor, gave Sam a brief, reassuring nod before turning to face the bench. Mr. Perkins, the judge began, her voice carrying an authority that seemed to fill the room. You have pleaded guilty to multiple charges, including abuse of power, falsifying reports, and assault. You have also provided substantial assistance to the prosecution in the case against Captain Collins and other officers within your precinct. Do you understand the gravity of these charges? Sam nodded, his throat tight. Yes, Your Honor. The judge's eyes bore into him, her expression severe but not unkind. You were a police officer, someone entrusted with the protection of the community. Instead, you chose to use your position to harm others, to engage in corrupt practices. This is a betrayal not only of your oath, but of the public trust. Sam felt a wave of shame wash over him, the weight of her words pressing down on him like a physical force. He glanced briefly at Malcolm, who watched him with a steady, unreadable gaze. Then he turned back to the judge, his voice low and trembling. I know, Your Honor. I'm so sorry for what I did. I can't change the past, but I've tried to help. I've tried to make things right. The judge's gaze softened, just a fraction. Your cooperation has been noted, Mr. Perkins. The information you provided was critical in securing convictions against multiple individuals who had engaged in criminal activities within the precinct. This will be taken into account in your sentencing. She paused, the room silent except for the faint rustle of papers. However, your actions have caused real harm to people. You participated in a system that perpetuated abuse and injustice. While your cooperation is commendable, it does not erase the damage you have done. Sam nodded, his heart pounding painfully in his chest. He knew what was coming, knew that he couldn't escape the consequences of his actions, but still, the fear gnawed at him, the uncertainty of what his future held. After careful consideration, the judge continued, her voice steady, I am sentencing you to 5 years in state prison, with the possibility of parole after 3 years, contingent upon continued cooperation and good behavior. This is a reduced sentence, reflecting the value of your assistance to the prosecution. Do you understand this sentence, Mr. Perkins? Sam felt a wave of relief and fear crash over him. 5 years. It was a long time, but it was less than he had feared. less than what he knew he deserved. He glanced at his attorney, who gave him a small, encouraging nod. "Yes, Your Honor," Sam said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." The judge nodded, her expression firm. "Make no mistake, Mr. Perkins. This sentence is a reflection of your cooperation, not a forgiveness of your actions. You will serve your time, and you will face the consequences of what you have done. Court is adjourned." The gavel came down with a sharp crack, and the room erupted into a flurry of motion. Sam sat still, his mind spinning, his heart racing. 5 years. It felt like both an eternity and a reprieve, a punishment and a chance. He knew he would serve his time, would face whatever came next. But there was a small, fragile hope in his chest, a hope that maybe, just maybe, he could start to rebuild, to find some way to make amends. His attorney patted him on the shoulder, murmuring something about next steps, about what to expect in the coming days. Sam nodded numbly, his thoughts still focused on the judge's words, on the reality of what lay ahead. As the room cleared, Malcolm approached, his expression calm but thoughtful. Sam looked up at him, his heart pounding. He wasn't sure what he expected. Maybe a final condemnation, a reminder that he would never truly escape the shadow of his actions. Instead, Malcolm just stood there for a moment, studying him. Then he spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "You did the right thing, Sam. You stood up and told the truth, even when it cost you everything. That matters." Sam felt a lump form in his throat, his eyes stinging with unshed tears. "I don't know if it's enough." Malcolm nodded slowly. "Maybe it isn't. But you can't change the past. You can only decide what you're going to do from here on out." Sam swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. "What do I do now?" Malcolm's gaze was steady, his expression serious. "You serve your time. You keep telling the truth. And when you get out, you find a way to keep doing the right thing." Sam nodded, his heart aching with a mixture of fear and determination. "I will. I promise." Malcolm held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded. "Take care of yourself, Sam." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Sam sitting alone at the table. He watched as Malcolm left the courtroom, a strange sense of finality settling over him. He knew that this was only the beginning, that he had a long road ahead of him, filled with challenges and uncertainty. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had a direction, a sense of purpose, however small. The guard approached, gesturing for Sam to stand. He did so, his legs trembling slightly as he walked towards the door. He felt the weight of his sentence, the reality of what lay ahead, but he also felt something else, a quiet, fragile resolve to face whatever came, to find some way to make the next chapter of his life mean something. As he was led away, he glanced back at the empty courtroom, at the place where he had faced his past, where he had stood up and told the truth. It wasn't redemption, not really, but it was a step, and for now, that was enough. The doors closed behind him, and Sam Perkins walked forward, ready to face the consequences of his actions, ready to start, however slowly, however painfully, the long process of making things right.